Deadhouse Gates by Steven Erikson is the second book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. And I've already done a spoiler-free review of this book. And despite that, I really want to talk about it some more. So if you have not read this book, please don't watch this because it will contain a lot of spoilers. I do already have a spoiler-free review up here on YouTube and on TikTok. So if you really want a review and you haven't read it yet, check that one out. This is one for people who kind of want my impressions that are a little bit more deep and where I can talk a little bit more about what actually happened in this book. So that's what I'm here for. That's what I'm going to talk about. So if you have not read this book, don't watch this video. Otherwise, you're free to watch it, hopefully enjoy it. It's going to sound like I'm rambling and ranting, and it's because I am, because as anyone who has read this book can tell you, a lot happened in it, and even though I have a lot of notes, I don't know what to talk about specifically and what not to talk about. Mostly because, yeah, I could do like a play-by-play, what happened in every chapter, what happened in every section of this book or book of this book, with how Erikson does it. Or I could just kind of talk about it more generally with characters and their story and where they go. And I'm going to do the latter. So I apologize if things are out of order. I'm trying to remember what happened in every section and not skip over certain parts of a character story or a group story. But with a book that is like 900 some pages, it's bound to happen. It's bound to happen. So I apologize. I'm not used to necessarily giving in-depth reviews or discussing it in front of a camera at least. So just bear with me. This is a first time for me. Starting off, we have probably who I would consider our main protagonist in this book, if there is a main protagonist in this book, and that is Felison. And I want to talk about her story first because, well, I think she's the most important. While I think there are other plot lines I enjoyed more in this book, I think Felison has by far the most important and thematic story throughout this. So I'm just going to kind of generally go over what happens in their story and my thoughts on it. So Felison is the sister of Ganos Peron, who we saw in Gardens of the Moon, right? And he was the main character in that book too. And what happens with Felison is she is like, I'm going to say 15 to 16 years old. And she's sold into slavery by her sister to prove that her sister, Tavor, was loyal to Lacine. Because it turns out Tavor was promoted to adjunct after Lorne died on Genebacus. And again, in order to prove that she's loyal, that she is able to take over this command, Tavor decides to sell her sister into slavery, and what happens from there is that Felison is put on this place called Skullcup. And Skullcup is this horrible prison where they are mining this dust or this material that can weaken or stop sorcery somehow. And a lot of really, really brutal things happen to Felison that I can't talk about in depth, mostly because I'll probably get my channel banned, but she gets assaulted in every way that you can imagine, including that way. She's abused. She is disregarded like a piece of garbage, and she has to basically use her body in order to have any sort of chance at surviving at all. And it is really, really brutal, and it's really sad. And because she's going through so much horrific stuff in this book, she gets addicted to, I believe, alcohol and also this drug that I don't remember the name of. Someone down below can definitely tell you what it is, but it's like opioids, I'm pretty sure, or at least it seems like it's opioids of some sort with a different name. And yeah, it's life is not going well for her, and she just is stuck in this chamber of depression and abuse, and she's just suffering. I mean, just straight up suffering constantly until there is this little rebellion that happens, which allows Felicin and her companions. I'm not going to remember the names because I'm really bad at remembering names. It's Hiboric and Bodden. It allows Bodden, Hiboric, and Felicin to escape. And from there, they go through some more horrific stuff where like blood flies show up and all sorts of crazy stuff that I'm not going to remember off the top of my head. But they do manage to escape Skullcup and wander out into the desert. And while they're out in the desert, Felicin is really just going through it. She's going through withdrawals. The dude who was abusing her died during the revolt by Bodden's hands, so she's trying to contemplate murdering him. And she also kind of wants to kill Hiboric because she feels like she was betrayed because they don't seem to respect the fact that she was using her body to give them a better chance at survival. And she's really just in a terrible spot mentally and physically. She's stuck out in the desert. She's been horribly abused for the last several months. And then the two companions she has are men who, in her eyes, do not care for her at all. Whether that's true or not, that is her perspective, right? So they go on this I'm going to call it soul-sucking adventure across the desert where they almost die like 100 billion times. And then they finally run into a character I'm going to just quickly talk about, Culp. And they meet up with this guy named Culp, who Dukir, who I'm going to talk about later, sent to find Hiboric because Dukir wants this historian to remain alive because he thinks it's important or whatever. So they get on this boat, and this entire time, this thing called the Whirlwind has been happening. And the Whirlwind is basically the revolution for the Seven Cities, kicked off by Shaik, who is this sorceress slash priestess slash like leader. And because of everything that has happened, there's this whole giant revolution going on. So they're going out to sea on this boat that Culp picked up, and they run into a mage who's flying through the sky because he's gone insane from being exposed to the dust that makes mages go crazy and suppress their powers for too long. And I believe his warren opens up somehow, and they go into it, and then they just experience a bunch of wild stuff. And I'm sorry that I'm not going into depth about this, but this is just off memory, right? They go into this warren where they run into this ship. And the ship is, I forget the name of it, but it's crewed by a bunch of dead bodies that are somehow not decomposed, despite this boat being gone for like, I think the last like 10 years or something crazy like that. Like it's been gone for like decades, maybe even longer, maybe centuries. Who knows? Nobody knows how long this boat's been gone, apparently. But it's crewed by a bunch of dead people. And they're just trying to figure out how to get out of the warren. And it seems like Culp somehow uses his warren to attract the power of a soul-taken dragon that's been like fallen apart. It's like a deceased dragon, and if I understand correctly, they like use this deceased dragon to ride on the back of it to escape the warren, but it burns the ship or something like that. But they do manage to escape, and they continue to survive. And again, I'm really sorry if I'm not going in depth enough, but this book is insane. And I'll be 100% honest. I was not invested in Fellison's story for the first like half of this book. So we continue on these misadventures. Culp ends up dying because a soul taken kills him, if I understand correctly. And then Fellison somehow, and this is the part that really confused me, ends up where this Shaikh, who has now passed away from an assassination, is. And the people guarding her realize that Fellison is actually Shaikh reborn, and she becomes the new leader of the Whirlwind. And that's basically what happens with her story. Now, I apologize if that sounds super vague, but like, I don't really understand the logistics of how Fellison became Shaikh. I understand that her journey, thematically speaking, was to scour her soul so she could be in prime position to take over this priestess role and be this leader of this great revolution against the Malazan Empire. But I like logistically don't know how they got to the same place. Not that it really matters, but it was a complaint I had, and I was talking about it to a bunch of Malazan fans, and they're like, "Oh, you just don't get it." No, I got like what happens thematically. It just seems like logistically this is impossible. But the Fellison plotline is bizarre. It's insane. It's really tough to read at certain points because she's experiencing so much abuse. And as you guys can imagine, when you're an abuse victim at that age and you experience that much, you tend to lash out at the people around you, whether they are good or bad. And she does that throughout the story. She is this very cynical, bitter girl who is so mean to everyone around her. And even though I sympathize with her and her struggle throughout this book, I also at the same time I was like, man, I didn't like her. I understood why she was the way she was, but I did not like her personality because she is just lashing out at everyone around her. However, by the end, when you kind of see it all come together and you see her become Shaikh Reborn, it just makes sense. Like, Erikson does a wonderful job with her thematically. And I've come back around on her plot line throughout this by the end. I was like, wow, Erikson is a genius. But I still think overall, probably my least favorite plot line, probably the one I was least invested in. Next, I want to talk about our favorite fiddler carrying person, Fiddler, and Kalam, and their storyline. So Fiddler, Kalam, Apsalar, and Crocus are all journeying together to get Apsalar back home. And her home is somewhere north of Malaz City, but they're all the way down in the Seven Cities because it is their belief, specifically Fiddler and Kalam and Quickben, that there is a Azath house that will allow them to then teleport to the Deadhouse in Malaz City. And the actual reason that they're doing all of this sneaking around and not trying to deliver Apsalar home immediately is so that Kalam and Fiddler alongside Quickben can kill Lasine for betraying the bridge burners and for making Dujek One Arm a rebel. Now, what we realize throughout this story is that Lasine has a huge brain. I mean, we're talking just a massive 4D brain, right? She is not playing chess or checkers. She's playing like 6D chess, right? She's just goated with the sauce. She realizes that, hey, I have foreseen this other holy war coming that is mentioned in Gardens of the Moon and will be the main plot of Memories of Ice, if I understand correctly. And I realized that, hey, we can't fight this alone. So what I need to do is basically disband the bridge burners and disband Dujek One Arm's host and make them seem like they're siding with the people of Genebacus, who are going to experience this holy war firsthand. And I'm going to make them allies so that Genebacus, especially the city of I'm not gonna remember it anymore. I'm so bad at this. But especially the major city in Gardens of the Moon backs up and decides to side with the Malazans, because this holy war is going to be massive. It's going to be like the biggest thing ever, and we need more allies, and the Malazans can't do it alone. So she has this major big brain moment where she plots, hey, everything in Gardens of the Moon happened for a reason. It turns out Lacine's actually maybe not entirely evil like we thought she was in Gardens of the Moon. And hey, also, I'm totally going to subvert expectations and actually make the people of Genebacus and Malazans fight together against this holy war, because otherwise everyone's going to die, right? And it's like, it's such a great subversion of expectations, because you genuinely think that, hey, this lady is terrible and that she's just like not right in the head. But it turns out she had a big brain all along. So she gets the people of Georgistan to team up with the Malazans, and Fiddler and Klom go on their separate adventures to try and get to this place where they can attempt to assassinate Lacine. And Kalam has probably the lesser story. He goes on this crazy adventure where he meets up with these refugees, and one of them is kind of into him and he's kind of into her, but he doesn't really know like how to talk to women, apparently. And he goes on this boat to try and get away from them because they're safe now after a long fight. And he then ends up at Malaz City, and it turns out this entire boat ride was being subverted by this dude who was secretly an assassin the entire time. He kills a ton of claws, who are these elite assassins, because he's the GOAT. He shows up at Lacine's palace, and he realizes all that information I dumped about what Lacine's plan is this entire time. And then Fiddler, on his own adventure, goes through this Azath house where he runs into Mappo and Ikarium, and a bunch of just crazy, bizarre stuff happens where they have to fight a bunch of Soul Taken to save the Azath house. And then it turns out that Crocus's familiar is going to be the new guardian of the Azath house, and then they teleport to Malaz City, and they run into Kalam and save his life, and they realize that, hey, Lacine had a big brain plan all along. So the entire reason why we wanted to kill her is completely null and void. It does not matter anymore. In fact, Kalam realizes, hey, I need like a break, because everything I just went through was completely banana sauce crazy, and I need to just like take a breather. So this lady that followed him the entire time and him end up deciding to go chill somewhere. I don't actually know where he's going, but Shadow Throne shows up and decides to give a boon to Kalam and to Fiddler and to the rest. So Kalam goes off with his lady to go relax for a little. Fiddler decides to re-enlist into the Malazan Empire so he can fight in 7 cities and overthrow the Whirlwind, which has been devastating the continent or whatever. And then Absalar and Crocus go back to her home. And that is their general plot line. Oh God. And then there is the final major overarching plot line. And my favorite, the one I've been waiting to talk about. And that is Coltane, Duker, and the 7th Malaz army, and the Crow and the Wiccan clans. Their plot line is called the Chain of Dogs. And as I mentioned before, 7 cities has been taken over by the Malazans for the last like 10 years or something like that, right? And finally, a bunch of people are getting kind of sick of their crap. And this whirlwind begins with Shaik, and it kicks off this revolution against the Malazans. And all across the seven cities, there are revolts, revolutions, whatever. And in one of the many places that is happening, the city that Coltane is in is under siege by the rebellion army. And he realizes he needs to get out immediately and go to Aran, which is halfway across the continent. In fact, it's on the other side of the continent, right? And that's basically the only place left that is even remotely safe for the Malazan people. The problem is that he and the Seventh Army and the different Wiccan clans need to protect like 50,000 refugees because basically the entire city is fleeing with him. So they go on this absolutely harrowing adventure across the entirety of Raraku, this desert, where they have to constantly fight against the whirlwind and its armies against crazy odds, right? There are like 4 or 5 battles throughout this. There's one that you don't see. There are 2 that you directly experience. Then there is one that you partially experience, and then there is one last fight that is the final stand of Coltane, right? But I kind of want to go more in depth. So they travel across this desert, and they have to fight against all these different odds, right? And every time there's a major battle that you see, it's always with Coltane and his army being the lesser force. And they basically have to find a new way every single time to subvert expectations. So the first time, they somehow get the spirits of the land to fight against the whirlwind army. Second time, they use sappers, who are basically engineers, to create this ramp up this like ridge, and blood magic to countercharge the army that's sitting on top of this ridge, and they win both times, right? And then there's Vethar's Crossing, where the refugees believe, because they're led by nobles, that this army they've been fighting against, Kobolo Dam, is going to let them cross, and it's just going to be all peaceful and stuff. That obviously doesn't work out. The refugees die by like the hundreds, and the army is completely surrounded. But somehow the army wins in spite of those things. The refugees specifically charge against the archers that are up on these platforms and rip them to pieces with their bare hands. And then finally, they get past this army and are struggling to get to Aran, the only city on the continent that's safe for them. And Coltane has this realization. They're not going to make it. There's just no way. There are like 5 different armies chasing them. There's nothing they can do. So Coltane decides, hey, Dukir, who is this historian who's been watching all these events as like a sideline character or has been participating in these events, should lead the refugees onto Aran by themselves with the help of a local horse clan or something like that. And Coltane and the Wiccan clans and the Seventh Army, what's left of them, is going to stay behind as a rear vanguard to fight against all of these armies. And somehow, miraculously, they make it all the way to Aran. 30,000 or 20,000 refugees out of 50,000 survive and get into the city of Aran. And Dukir gets up on this rampart to see Coltane, who has made it just outside the city. They're just within reach. They have an entire army within the city, and nobody helps them. So Coltane, on this hill outside of Aran, makes his last stand with the army. And they kill everyone. They kill the Crow clan. They kill every single Malazan soldier. and then they crucify Coltane up on this cross, right? And they just try and keep him alive because they want to, I don't know, show off. This Kobolo Dom wants to show off and show how great he is. But thankfully, this archer, whose name I'm totally not going to remember, ends up taking Coltane's life for him so that the crows can come and take his soul for him to be reborn. And that is kind of the end of the chain of dogs. But it is, like, it is genuinely some of the best military fantasy I've ever read in my entire life. It's probably some of the most harrowing stuff I've ever read in my entire life out of fantasy. I mean, this army that has been starving and dying of thirst for the last, 3,000 leagues have traveled across this entire ginormous desert at their own expense to save thousands and thousands of refugees. And they fight against all these crazy odds in all these crazy ways. And you just absolutely fall in love with this army and what they're willing to sacrifice for these people. And then at the end, they just all die, including Coltane, who I think is very easily the best character in this entire book. And he does not even get a point of view chapter. He does not even get a point of view chapter, but he is that just present in the story that I think he deserves the best character. I mean, the stuff that this dude pulls off by being a great fist, by having all these men believe in him, and by basically leading this entire ginormous army to ruin and saving these refugees is nothing short of a miracle. Unfortunately, Dukir and the armies inside Aran, for some reason, the leaders inside the Aran army decide, hey, this is our chance. These whirlwind armies are outside our gates. Let's just go knock them down. Well, one of the leaders of this army was obviously lied to, and because they're such a bumbling moron, they all die, and then Dukir is crucified. And then that is basically not how the book ends, but that is how Dukir's story ends. And it's just like insanely sad. Thankfully, there is an epilogue, and it is heavily implied that Coltane, the man of the hour, is reborn because the crows got to him. And that is how the book ends. So that is very, very generally what happened in Deadhouse Gates. Now, for me, if I had to rank each storyline, I'm going to say Chain of Dogs, very easily number one. I think it's got the best overall story. I think it's got the best overall characters. And it's just really fun to read. Like, if you like military fantasy, if you like military action, and you kind of like seeing battles and harrowing stories about soldiers, I think that this is really going to work, right? And then you get, like, the Kalam, Apsalar, Crocus, Fiddler storyline. And I just really like their adventure. I really like just them hanging out and going across this desert and having horrible misadventures. And then overall, I'm going to say right below that, the Felison plotline. I think her plotline is really wonderfully done, but the first half of it was kind of rough for me. I'm just going to be honest. I didn't really enjoy it, right? And then below that is the Mappo and Ikarian plotline. I think they probably have the best dynamic between two characters in this series so far. However, I think their plotline overall, at least at first, was kind of like, okay, but what are we doing? Like, what are we doing? It took a very long time for me to see the full picture. And as attached as I am to those two characters, I still think their plotline is just kind of, it's just lacking that special distinction that, like, the Kalam Fiddler plotline has, or that really emotional sucker punch that Felison has, or that really holy crap, I can't believe I just read all of that and now I see the bigger picture and I just can't get it out of my brain. Chain of Dogs plotline. So for me, that's going to be like dead last. I think this book overall, though, really, really, really good. Just really wonderfully written. I think every plot line in here is good. I think some are better than others, obviously, but everything is great. Everything is great. And there's so much in this book that I did not talk about that is discussed. Like, we learn more about the Azathoses. We learn generally more about Warrens. We learn that the former emperor is Shadow Throne. It's like spelled out very clearly that he's Shadow Throne. And his second hand is now Cotillion, who is like the patron of assassins. There's probably more stuff besides that is laid out. Like, I think it's pretty heavily hinted at that there's going to be a major war in the next book. I think it's pretty heavily hinted at that there's way more going on with the Felison plotline, and this is not where we're going to leave her. And she's going to be a major player in the future books. There's a lot left to talk about, but that is generally what happened in the book and what I enjoyed in the book. I just, like, this book is really good. And I wish I were intelligent enough to tell you all of the different themes and discuss in depth about, oh, this character is representing this. I'm not, but the themes are really good. Obviously, sacrifice, transformation, compassion, what it means to be human, how far a soldier is willing to go, all of those things, right? I think all of the characters are very good. Even the characters I liked the least, such as Felison for the first half of the story, are very well thought out. I think this book is much darker, tonally speaking, but it really works. I also think the humor is way better in this book. There were a lot of moments in Gardens of the Moon that made me laugh, but there are way more moments in this where I was just chuckling, especially with some of the stuff that like Fiddler does specifically. Really, really funny. But yeah, that is my more in-depth review of Deadhouse Gates. I think Chain of Dogs, easily the best storyline for me. I think Felison is a very interesting character, and I want to know more about her transformation in Shaik. I really want to see more Mappo and Ikariam. I kind of want to see their dynamic more because I think they're just a great duo. And yeah, I mean, this book was just top to bottom great. I'm really looking forward to Memories of Ice. I'm certain I'm missing a lot of details. I'm sure I could do and talk about way more, but that's what I got for right now. If there's something specific you guys want me to talk about, I definitely can, but that is my more in-depth review for Deadhouse Gates. Again, I can give it a 9.2 out of 10 like I did for my spoiler-free review. I mean, this book just slaps. This is probably one of my favorite books I've read all year. And if Memories of Ice can top this, I mean, this is already probably going to be a favorite series of mine, but I think if Memories of Ice is somehow better than this, it's going to get on that list way sooner. Because it's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable what Erikson can do with his characters and what he can do with his plot and how it all connects and how there's so much information in this book that I'm sure I did not pick up on this first time reading it. And I just, it's weird to say that I'm literally 2 books into Malazan, right? And there are 8 more to go in just the main series and like 26 more to go in the entire series with Ian C. Alsamon and the rest of what Erikson writes. And yet, I can't wait to reread this. I can't wait to dive more in depth with what this world is doing and what Erikson is trying to say and how he writes characters and how he writes action. I mean, this dude is just another level of an author, in my opinion. I'm blown away by how good this is. and I can't wait for more. So for now, that is all. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. Please leave any criticisms or critiques down below. I'm more than willing to listen to them. Again, this is my first time trying to do an in-depth review, and this book is super dense with information, so I apologize if it's not as good as you're used to, but hopefully we can go into this series in the future and I get better and better at this and discussing all of it. For now, that's everything I got. If you like this video, please like, please subscribe. Please let me know what your thoughts of Deadhouse Gates are, because this book it's really good. It's really, really good.